And so encryption is basically reintroducing the equivalent of walls and doors and things like that in a digital world. It's basically making it so that there's effort to violate someone's privacy, that resources have to be expended for a good reason to do it, sometimes a bad reason, but either way. And Bitcoin is the same thing for money, that it basically, the default can be towards non-debasement and censorship resistant, and if someone wants to interfere with that, there's a cost for them to trying to do so. And I think that's a good thing, and I think that people don't think that way now too much, but I think that in other eras, that was the norm.
Hey guys, welcome to Everyday Finance. Although there have been many groundbreaking moments in the history of Bitcoin, something even more important than a price increase is currently taking place. Bitcoin is changing. It's evolving from a sophisticated tool for tech-savvy enthusiasts to one that's usable by the general public, including your parents. According to analyst Lyn Alden, Bitcoin is similar to the internet before web browsers in that it is strong, but difficult for most people to understand. Similar to how Netscape made the internet accessible to everyone, Bitcoin is about to have its own browser moment. Sending transactions no longer feels like throwing coins into thin air. Wallets are becoming more user-friendly, and user experience is keeping up with technological advancements. This is by no means the end of the work. Serious attention is still required for issues like privacy, scalability, and user onboarding. No one wants to explain seed phrases at the dinner table. This time is different, though, because the infrastructure is strong and rapidly attracting developers and entrepreneurs. Bitcoin could become the cornerstone of a new, parallel financial system if it can successfully complete this transition, rather than merely launching another bull market. One that is unrestricted, open, and intended for practical use rather than mere speculation. How soon this will happen is the question now, not if it will. Perhaps more crucially, are you prepared? Watch the video.
So one quick example before we even get into that is how the Overton window can shift based on technology. So back in the 1800s, transactions were inherently pretty private. And even if you were an authoritarian king or something, the idea that you could surveil everyone's transactions was not even really thinkable. Fast forward to today, everybody's using these centralized digital ways to transfer value to each other, and so anyone who wants to transact privately is often viewed as weird. Like, why? I have nothing to hide. What are you trying to hide with your private transactions? And yet, that's just the default has shifted, even though the need for privacy has not really shifted. And so Bitcoin's in that boat where, people kind of like, well, what do you mean you want like money outside of the state, like money that can't be just debased or that can't be stopped? Like, what kind of bad things must you be up to? And that's not really how it works. I would remind the audience that there are 200 countries in the world. Some of them are fairly benign. Other ones are fairly harsh. You can imagine if you're in any one of the countries that's run by dictators and things like that. I mean, we're in Madeira right now at Bitcoin Atlantis, and then I was on stage with Farida. She's from Togo, where democracy advocates would have their bank accounts frozen and seized and things like that, right? And that's one example of dozens and dozens out there. And so basically, for anyone who thinks Bitcoin has no value, they're often from fairly privileged environments. In the United States, most people don't, even though there's subtle problems with the system, most people don't go throughout their day and think, man, payments are really hard to make. And for savings, they can plow money into the S&P 500, right? Whereas in many countries in the world, they don't have that. Their money debases more quickly. There's 40 currencies in Africa, over 40 currencies. Imagine the friction of trying to do trade across 40 different currencies. Latin America has like 30 plus different currencies. These are all frictions that people face in their more daily life. And Bitcoin comes along, and Bitcoin is money that can't be debased, money that flows across borders, money that is very hard to censor. There's a high cost to trying to censor the network. And so that's all it is. And people are kind of like, they're so ingrained in the current system, they can't see why that would be valuable to people. And it's money that's portable. You can bring it with you around the world. You can self-custody it. No centralized entity can debase it. And if people want to, if you're doing something illegal, law enforcement can still extend resources to stop you from what you're doing, but the burden lies on them to expend resources to get you to stop. They can't just freeze your money arbitrarily outside of the rule of law and ask questions later. It kind of shifts power back closer to the people. That there's still power structures out there, but it now shifts the effort to them. I think another way of putting it is that it used to be that privacy was expensive to violate, right? So if you wanted to violate someone's privacy for maybe a good reason, you had to go through their physical possessions, follow them around, do things like that. But in the digital age, privacy is just easy to violate. Big databases can just collect any information they want. They can organize it with AI, and the default is not to be private. And so encryption is basically reintroducing the equivalent of walls and doors and things like that in a digital world. It's basically making it so that there's effort to violate someone's privacy, that resources have to be expended for a good reason to do it, sometimes a bad reason, but either way. And Bitcoin is the same thing for money, that it basically, the default can be towards non-debasement and censorship resistant, and if someone wants to interfere with that, there's a cost for them to trying to do so. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good thing, and I think that people don't think that way now too much, but I think that in other eras, that was the norm. Yeah, I think, and use that analogy, it's like figuring out farming before you figure out running water and basic medicines, and that's a really rough time frame. That's hard. You have some advantages, but you have a ton of disadvantages from so many people in a closed space and not a lot of the hygiene and ways to deal with the problems. And again, we had enough bandwidth to figure out transactions at the speed of light, but not enough bandwidth for settlements at the speed of light. And it took, a century and a half or more, but now we're there. And so this kind of a period we've become accustomed to, that in many ways there's lots of good things happening. So semiconductors and energy and all that has made our lives way better, but money's been the weaker spot. Kind of like how in that other era, in some ways standard of living was better, but disease was the problem. And now it's like a lot of things are better, but money is the problem. And so I think we can enter a new era where we finally have the equivalent of running water and basic medicines in the world of monetary technology. We no longer have to have this kind of local maximum that we've been stuck in.
Bitcoin is able to rewrite the rules that govern money. Bitcoin is now able to offer both the strength of gold and the speed of the internet, whereas gold did so by virtue of its indestructibility and fiat currency did so by virtue of its speed. It is not subject to censorship, it has no borders, and it is resistant to inflation and seizure. In this case, innovation is not the same thing as disruption. Because it threatens their monopoly on money, governments and central banks are the ones who are afraid of it. The transfer of value is unstoppable and unrestricted. There will be no more frozen accounts or capital controls. The financial systems of privileged nations are stable, but billions of people are facing the possibility of having their funds frozen, hyperinflation, and economic chaos. Bitcoin provides a means of escape. In place of trust, it is based on mathematical calculations. Not only is it a form of digital currency, but it is also a global lifeline and a decentralized alternative to monetary systems that are ineffective. Bitcoin, as defined by Lyn Alden, is a symbol of freedom because it enables individuals, regardless of location, to opt out of being subject to financial repression. Here is more than just an improvement in technology. It is a mass movement, a form of financial autonomy that gives power to those who are powerless and challenges the established order of things. Bitcoin is the vehicle through which the revolution is taking place. Banks are not the source. Let's delve even further into this topic by examining excerpts from the enlightening interview that Lyn Alden gave.
So I think a good way of thinking about it is, what are monies you can bring with you that you have a high probability that you can spend it, no matter where you go. And so some people might say they're Visa cards because it can just translate it to whatever currency there's working on, but that's reliant on a chain of trust that they hope works. If some automatic trigger goes off for fraud, their card could be shut off and they could be in the middle of another country and not being able to spend anything and have to sort that out. So if you think of money that are bearer assets that you can bring with you and you can spend anywhere, near the top list are things like dollars or gold coins. If you bring dollars anywhere in the world, you can sometimes pay them to merchants directly, or at least you could find a broker willing to kind of convert to the local currency for you. Same thing with gold. You're less likely to be able to spend it anywhere, but there's plenty of points in any country where you can convert gold to the local currency and spend what you need to do. And then euros and silver coins and things like that would be kind of next on the list. And after that, it rapidly falls off. I've made the analogy that if I have Norwegian currency in New Jersey from a trip I did, and even though that's a wealthy country, there's very little I can do with Norwegian currency. That's an arcade token that's way outside of its arcade, and it's a pretty small arcade. Similarly, I have Egyptian currency, and that's a country of 100 million people, but there's nothing I can do with that in New Jersey. The conversion points are few and far between and very expensive, and it quickly loses its moneyness. So there's 160 different currency arcades out there. There's a handful of monies like gold and dollars that can kind of flow between them and get recognized as money in every arcade. And Bitcoin is quickly becoming another one of those, and probably over time the best one. It's already, there's more things I can do with Bitcoin in New Jersey, Norway, and Egypt than I can do with any of those weaker currencies anywhere else. So I think that it's not quite at the level of, say, gold or dollars yet, but in a 15-year time frame, that trajectory has already put it in the top 10, maybe the top 5 monies that if you bring with you, you could do something with it. If you come to Madeira with Bitcoin, there's a lot of places where you can convert or spend it. And that's true for a lot of different countries around the world, a lot of different specific regions within countries. And so I think that what's happening is that over time, Bitcoin can displace a lot of the weaker currencies and start working its way up the food chain, and that's what it's already been doing. And people around the world will hold a larger and larger percentage of their liquid, cash value in Bitcoin rather than their local currency. Well, I think the interesting part is that if you play it 100 times, eventually something like Bitcoin would come around, right? At least as long as you get that far in a game, right? So I think in some scenarios, the world blows itself up with nuclear weapons and we go back 100 years in terms of technology, right? So there's certain, the longer you go, there's more paths that can diverge. But I think once you get to a point of an internet-connected world, it's inevitable that some sort of good digital value would start to emerge. And maybe in some world, the first one's scammy. Imagine if Satoshi was smart but scammy, and he made this scam version. Maybe the second one was the better one. Maybe in some worlds that happens. But I think in either way, once you have encryption at this level, once you have bandwidth at this level, something starts to emerge. And what we saw in Bitcoin history was, pre-Bitcoin, David Chaum in the early 1980s published literature on how to do decentralized ledgers or databases. That was kind of the precursor to Bitcoin. Then we saw proof of work and Hashcash get invented. Then we saw reusable proof of work tokens they were almost Bitcoin, but they were reliant on a centralized server. And then they Satoshi figured out how to break this up, how to distribute this, how to have a control loop to take into account faster processing time. So I think that Bitcoin would reemerge given enough technology, kind of like how if you go from Paleolithic to Neolithic, and then eventually you find hydrocarbons, and fewer people have to farm because you can mechanize the farming, and more people can work on other things, and they can develop medicine and running water and things like that. Eventually, if the world's not hit by an asteroid or something doesn't disrupt that process, you reach that extra point. And I think that's where we are with money. I think that given enough time, you eventually recreate digital value and start threatening these power structures. And I think that there's some timelines where maybe it takes longer because some of the early actors are not good, and it has to kind of restart the process a couple times. And I think we're so far on a pretty good timeline where the first person to figure it out did it in a very ethical way, in a very well-designed way. So I'm from the US, so there's less blatant money problems than many other parts of the world. I was already, I was working as an engineering manager. I was, investing heavily in the stock market. So in that sense, my life didn't change too much. I guess the way it changed was most of my financial work back then was describing problems with the system and not really having a solution. It was just saying, here's the problems, here's I'm kind of using this patchwork ways to deal with it. And here's this kind of long-term arc that's happening. And what I think is cool about Bitcoin is it's a solution to a lot of those problems. It kind of added optimism to how I view the current system. And it's the only asset that I fly around the world to talk about, right? So I'm in Madeira here to talk about Bitcoin. There's a lot of friends in my life that I only knew because of our shared interest in Bitcoin. A lot of the businesses I'm involved in, I'm on the board of a Bitcoin company. I'm a general partner of Ego Death Capital, a Bitcoin venture firm. And these things are only happening obviously because the Bitcoin network exists and the asset exists, and it's exciting, and it's a solution for a lot of the problems that we're talking about. So I would say certainly in some of those more qualitative ways, it's been impactful. And then obviously the desire to kind of focus on Bitcoin more than just traditional finance can only happen because of Bitcoin. So yeah, it changed my life.
The recent drop in the price of Bitcoin to $81,000 in response to Trump's announcement of tariffs highlights the fact that it is currently functioning as a high-beta macro asset, moving in tandem with market sentiment and the strength of the dollar. On the other hand, this short-term volatility conceals its more fundamental purpose, which is to create a censorship-resistant and globally accessible monetary network, digital gold for the digital age. While investors are preoccupied with charts and technical analysis, Bitcoin is quietly becoming a lifeline for people living in economies that are unstable and for those who are excluded from traditional financial institutions. A reactive risk asset as well as an emerging store of value, particularly in nations that are experiencing inflation or capital controls. It is a particularly useful asset. According to Lyn Alden, the real significance of Bitcoin lies not in its daily price swings, but rather in its adoption as a viable form of hard currency. This dual identity provides investors with not only the potential for short-term trading, but also the potential for long-term transformational value. Bitcoin is not just a form of speculation. Rather, it is a way to take part in the process of revitalizing the monetary system. It's possible that the dips will occur, but the demand for a decentralized and reliable financial system is only going to increase. Thanks for watching.